Lecture 4, Globalization and the Regulation of International Labor Markets. Dr. Marquita Walker, Department of Labor Studies, IUPUI. Why international labor standards? Because products are created and marketed via global supply chains, the ethical treatment of workers in those supply chains is not controlled through the regulation of individual governments, but rather through some sort of transnational arrangement which regulates workers' rights and conditions of employment. Proponents of neoliberalism suggest nation-states' ability to attract new international business is not eroded, but rather reworked, and nation-states are simply not enforcing their existing regulations for fear of driving away international investment. The development of global supply chains make it possible for manufacturing activities to be distanced from the multinational companies, which are the owners of production, who control them, which means insecurity and vulnerability through subcontracting of work. Also, since nation-states can't control their own regulations, workers look to international standards which often don't exist. Since national agreements are viewed as undesirable because of decreased interest in foreign direct investment, the need for transnational agreements looms large. One pressing reason is the issue of Global South workers who receive low wages, work long hours, and have very poor working conditions. Multinational companies which seek to produce at the lowest cost create a race to the bottom through exploitive working conditions. Increased technological communication means more global North public awareness concerning these poor conditions. Global North workers are concerned about the ethical and moral issues involved in these exploitive practices, as well as concerns for their own jobs because of an increase in cheap products. This has led to an anti-globalization campaign led by activists who question the ethical and moral imperatives of neoliberal policies. The debate over international labor standards. Proponents of globalization deny globalization supports a race to the bottom and tout that the global South benefits because of increased employment. Though the jobs pay poorly as compared to the global North, they are better than no jobs, proponents say. They contend globalization lifts millions, especially women, out of poverty, and that efforts toward creating and enforcing labor standards should be aimed at the informal section of economies, which is where acute exploitation begins. Globalization proponents say regulating international labor standards unfairly helps the global North at the expense of the global South by weakening competitive advantage of lower labor costs, which attracts investment. Another argument proponents make is the stages of development argument, which says various countries produce at different levels depending upon their stage of productive development. For example, currently developed countries used to use child labor in their early productive stages, and countries in the global South are still in their productive infancy. Opponents of the stages of development argument contend there is a moral imperative to treat workers with dignity, eradicate harsh and exploitive conditions, and discontinue child labor as a path to cheaper production. Opponents of globalization say we do not need to assume this is an either-or argument. Globalization opponents advocate international labor standards should be a part of a more sustainable model of economic development, not dependent upon multinational investment. Labor standards should be part of a positive approach to long-term growth and productivity. The International Labor Organization posits the inclusion of health and safety provisions will go a long way in reducing workplace injuries. raise workers' morale, and reduce insurance costs due to injuries. The International Labor Organization believes international labor standards are a key influence on productivity. Core and non-core labor standards. Core labor standards or rights concern the organization of employment, are process-oriented, and don't adversely affect the ability of a country to attract investment. Their presence doesn't assume specific employment outcomes such as set wages or number of hours worked. They include the eradication of exploitive child labor, the prohibition of slave labor, workers' freedom of association in trade unions, the right to bargain collectively, and non-discrimination in employment. Non-core labor standards, on the other hand, are outcome-oriented, relate to the substance of the employment relationship, and might adversely affect the ability of a country to attract multinational investments. They include wages, benefits, minimum wage laws, holidays and vacations, and those things that are economically related outcomes. The question being raised with whether core labor rights are considered rights in the traditional vein of human rights is this. Human rights movements traditionally have been more concerned with civil and political rights, such as the freedom of expression, the freedom from state coercion, or not to be imprisoned without a trial. More and more, scholars are becoming interested in core labor rights as an effective tool for advancing the interest of workers worldwide, which frames the goals of workers as rights. The debate centers around whether it would be more appropriate to think about what workers want in terms of social and economic goals rather than rights. Multilateral arrangement for regulating labor standards. The International Labor Organization, or the ILO, was formed in 1919 to promote labor standards through conventions, which are strong suggestions onto which countries must sign. An agency of the United Nations, the ILO was conceived by the Global North in an effort to protect its own economies from cheap, unregulated labor in the Global South. The ILO's complicated process for enacting labor standards is laborious and complicated. Its tripartite structure requires employer, union, and government representatives to agree on new conventions and then seek compliance from each country. Compliance is voluntary and can't be enforced. The ILO was marginalized in the neoliberal economy and is no longer considered a player in regulating labor standards. The likelihood of melding the neoliberal agenda of free trade with multinational trading agreements which encourage any type of protectionist language for specific countries is unlikely to produce results in the foreseeable future. Suggestions have included a social clause in the World Trading Organization, which would place stringent conditions on the Global South to meet some sort of floor for labor rights. It was rejected by the Global South as imposing harsh restrictions on their ability to compete with the Global North. The focus of the ILO currently is to accommodate rather than challenge a neoliberal agenda, and is considered a less effective agency in protecting workers' interests. In order to become more effective, the ILO must abandon its outdated model of working to protect the standard employment relationship and move toward improving the lives of workers everywhere. Private regulation and codes of conduct. Because there exists no effective mechanism for developing and maintaining an international standard of labor rights, the trend is for multinational companies to develop their own codes of conduct for their global supply chains. These voluntary frameworks define objectives, guidelines, and commit the multinational company to a set of minimum standards of working conditions and labor rights. Multinational companies use these codes as public relations campaigns to protect their brands and convince consumers in the global north the workers in the global south making products for consumption are being treated respectfully and work under humane conditions. These codes are seen by multinational companies as flexible and responsive to multi-subcontracted suppliers across the globe and complement and supplement arrangements for organizing production. Yet these codes do not challenge the existing power structures, do nothing for labor rights, and promote worker vulnerability. Without some provision to enforce the codes and sanctions or punishments for violating the codes are ineffective in addressing labor regulations and workers' rights. Private regulation has replaced state regulation and generally doesn't work. Complementing the old adage about the fox guarding the henhouse, there are significant problems which impede conduct codes of multinational companies from improving labor rights. Conduct codes are managerial tools designed to promote management power and goals and not workers' rights. Workers or their representatives have little to no input into the code development. Codes do not include freedom of association clauses and are designed to avoid unionization. Weak sanctions for noncompliance, few auditing standards, and misleading auditing reports belie a neoliberal agenda which seeks to circumvent workers' rights in profit-seeking maximization. Codes of conduct alone are not sufficient to protect labor rights, but the code may have some effect on promoting workers' self-organization and grassroots mobilizing in the form of workers' collectives, activist networks, which demand an end to unsatisfactory labor rights.